So I'm glad you guys are here. We're continuing in our Jesus Is series. Today, the title of the sermon is Jesus is the Asham. And that might make more sense to you later, hopefully. If you don't know what that means by the end of this, I failed. John 19. All right, John 19. And we're going to verses 31 through 42. Sometimes I feel like we all kind of know these little pieces in the gospel, but as we were talking about the fact that we kind of have already gone through the crucifixion and the resurrection because we jumped ahead, we said, well, no, how are we supposed to get through John? I felt like the Lord said, don't miss this. So we're going to stay here. In John 19, after Jesus has been crucified, this is what results. Now then, and that means after Jesus had been crucified, since it was the day of preparation, to prevent the bodies from remaining on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews requested of Pilate that their legs be broken and the bodies be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first man and of the other who was crucified with him. But after they came to Jesus, when they saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Yet one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, so that you also may believe. For these things took place, so that the scripture would be fulfilled, not a bone of him shall be broken. Now we believe this is the Apostle John who's speaking these words and writing these words. And it's important for us to take a moment and acknowledge that the crucifixion actually did happen, that Jesus did die. Just the idea even of the blood and the water, what's that? It just means our blood begins to separate once we have died. And that was the idea, to be able to see these things. Also just the fact that they didn't end up breaking his legs. And sometimes I think that the Jews, even though they knew that would accelerate the death process, because once your legs are broken, right, you will no longer have the strength to prop yourself up on this cross. I also sometimes get this feeling like maybe they knew too some of these things that people were talking about wanting to be fulfilled, and they were trying to do everything they could to erase the idea of Jesus being the Messiah. But when we look at this, it's important to understand that that's not where the story ends. That is not actually the story of the gospel. The crucifixion is the beginning of a new era. The resurrection is the power and the reality that what Jesus has done and his sacrifice can remain forever. And that sacrifice, brothers and sisters, as he died on the cross, he died in our place. And it says that in him doing so, he gave his righteousness to us. And so we understand that concept as Christians often, this idea that Jesus died on the cross to take away our sin. And I just want to go a little bit and explore that a little bit today and look at what happened while Jesus was in the grave. So let's just take this moment. In verse 38 it says, and this is where we're going to concentrate today, and after these things, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but a secret one for fear of the Jews, requested of Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate granted permission. So he came and took away his body. Nicodemus, who had first come to him by night, also came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 litras of weight. So they took the body of Jesus, bound it in linen wrappings with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden was a new tomb in which no one had been laid. Therefore, because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. The end. Not actually, but for today. Now, I have a question for you. This is a question that is important, and maybe I'll give you a little bit of context. So when criminals died on the cross, it was kind of part of the whole thing that they would then be laid there, either left on the cross or laid on the ground, and that they wouldn't be taken care of, that they would allow the vultures to come and eat them, and the whole thing was very macabre, but it was there like to teach a lesson, okay? So in reality, you weren't supposed to be able to come get that person from the cross and bring them anywhere or do anything with them, because it was part of like the overall punishment and lesson for everyone to learn. Now, Pilate, in this case, however, does grant permission for Jesus' body to go. So I just want you to think about, this is something he does. It's kind of out of the ordinary. We have somebody named Joseph of Arimathea who is clearly, he's a Jewish man, and he has a lot of money, okay? And he has this tomb, and it's important that you understand this tomb is empty, meaning that this tomb has been created, okay? And it and usually what happened is you would have a tomb, a cave, okay, which is really a cave, a dug-out place, all right? And you would have a number of people in there. So that's why you would wrap them so well, because what you would want to do is to have the spices and the aromas cover the decaying process, and then the bones were laid to rest when they were just bones. And you would have multiple people in a family in a tomb. And so this is important because this tomb is empty, meaning there's nothing else and no one else in there. And it's a great sacrifice to take basically your family's tomb, the one that you're going to be laid, and you give it to somebody else. Okay? It's not cheap. All right? And then we have Nicodemus, who we encountered earlier in the gospel, and both of them are here, and Nicodemus brings so much spice that it's far more than what you normally would give, all right? In fact, it's so large that many people think it's an exaggeration, but the reality is it is the equivalent of what you would bring if you were going to bury a king. And so both of these men are doing these things, and both of these men are actually a part of the Sanhedrin, the council who condemned Jesus to die. Now, we find in other passages that people like Joseph didn't really consent to this, but at the same time, they were a part of the council. So now I want to ask this question, just in the case of Pilate, in the case of Joseph and Nicodemus, why do you think they're doing what they're doing? Guilt. I mean, don't you think Pilate feels a little something? We hear all the stuff he says about Jesus, and he does something out of the ordinary because, quite frankly, he feels bad about it. We have Nicodemus and we have Joseph of Arimathea, and maybe they could or maybe they couldn't do something, but their names are stamped on his death certificate because they're a part of the council that put him to death, and they're doing the only thing they know how to do at this point to try to make amends. I mean, let's think about Judas. Why does Judas bring the silver back? Why does Judas end up hanging himself? Guilt. When all the disciples run away and just gather together in their own little place all by themselves and don't even stay with, why is that? And so this is where I came to this week. And as I was reading, I just felt like God said, that's exactly what Aaron got it right. Aaron said it right away. It took me a minute, but I felt like God was telling me, why do they do that? And I just finally said, guilt? He's like, guilt. And so today we're going to take a little bit of time to just understand guilt. Because we say guilt a lot, and we use the word a lot. Like, I feel guilty for eating that entire tub of ice cream. Right? Now, is that really what guilt is, right? And that's what we kind of have to unpack. So what is the worldly, like, if you went to go to get a definition for it, I just went to get a definition from the world. I think this is from Webster. I'm not sure. All right? Feeling guilty is an emotional response that occurs when you believe you have compromised your personal values or caused harm to someone else. It is the mind's way of signaling that you have violated your moral standards or fallen short of your own expectations. Does that sound about right? That sounds like how we understand guilt. Okay? Now, I don't know if you know this, but that's not really how the Bible understands guilt. Now, we also know that guilt's used in legal situations, correct? So in a legal sense, right, a factual sense, guilt means that someone has committed a crime, right, breached some sort of rule, done something wrong, caused a punishable offense. And so they're guilty. And that really is a little bit more in line with the biblical sense of it. And then we have this whole thing where we have these bedfellows, guilt and shame. And what's the difference? Anybody know the difference? Feeling guilty and feeling ashamed, what's the difference? And it's important in this case because I want us to really, I hope, hear what God is trying to teach us today. Because guilt really focuses on behavior. And shame is really about identity. Okay? Now, there is somebody that I'm sure we've all heard, and I'm not necessarily on board with all the stuff she says. In fact, I'm not. But Brené Brown, right? She said it this way, and I think it's really good. Guilt is, I did something bad. And so you have to understand that in order for us to even come, there has to be an admission or a conviction, right? A confession or a conviction. I did something bad. That's my behavior, right? And shame is, I am bad. So what you have to understand is that guilt typically comes first. And when not addressed, usually devolves into shame, which is, I've done something bad, I must be bad, I can never do something good again, and we live in shame because of our guilt. Now, how about the Bible? All right, now this is interesting because I went and said, okay, I'm just going to do a search. I'm going to figure out all the times that guilt is in the Bible, and then that will teach us what we're supposed to know. But did you know that there's like a couple instances where Jesus says something like, you will be guilty, and we'll see this in a moment. But in the New Testament, there really isn't much talk of guilt. If you want to find guilt, you got to go to the Old Testament. So that's what I did. Leviticus 5, one of your favorite books of all time, right? Leviticus. Some of you are like, Leviticus, I just skip over that one. The law doesn't apply to me. I'm a Christian. But I just want us to see this for a second because I think it'll give us some deep understandings today. It says, now if a person sins after he hears a public order to testify when he is a witness, whether he has seen it or otherwise known, if he does not tell it, then he will bear his punishment. In other words, if you know of something that you should say and you don't say it, then you're guilty of not saying it. Or if a person touches any unclean thing, whether a carcass of an unclean animal, a carcass of an unclean cattle, a carcass of unclean swarming things, though it is hidden from him, he is unclean, then he will be guilty. Now, I want you to understand that what this really is talking and referencing in most of these spaces is something that is also damaging the community. You say, well, what if I touch something unclean? Well, yeah, and then if you bring that into the community, you make the community unclean. All right? If I don't keep the truth going in my community, I harm my community. And in verse 3 it says, or if he touches human uncleanness or whatever sort of uncleanness may be with which he becomes unclean and it is hidden from him and he comes to know it, he will be guilty. See, sometimes we do things we don't know that they were wrong. We didn't understand that they hurt somebody else or within our community. Later we find it out, right? It doesn't make us unguilty of that. It just made us unaware of what we were guilty of. And so this is saying when you become aware of that, you have to assume your guilt. In verse 4, or if a person swears thoughtlessly with his lips or to do evil or to do good. This is interesting because he's even talking about things we say. In whatever matter people speak thoughtlessly with an oath, and it is hidden from him, and then he comes to know it, he will be guilty of one of these things. So it shall be when he becomes guilty of one of these things that he shall confess that in which he has sinned. So this is the first thing. How do we deal with guilt? The first is an acknowledgement, a confession that we have not done well and we have compromised the community that God has placed us in, and we have compromised our relationship with God. And then in verse 6, and this is where it becomes very, very interesting, he shall also bring his guilt offering to the Lord. Now, this is interesting because do you know that there is a sin offering? And it's different than a guilt offering? So we have to understand this because a guilt offering has a different standard. It has a different purpose. So this is the guilt offering. The guilt offering is the Asham. And so the primary purpose is to make amends. That is the purpose of the Asham, to make amends for offenses where you've done something against God, misusing sacred objects, right? Or, listen very carefully, or a neighbor. And this is the kind of thing where you create and understand that what you have done creates a loss or a hurt for someone else. And the key is that within the Asham is the necessity for, wait till you get to hear it because some of us love this word, restitution. Compensation to the victim was mandatory. Not only that, it was an additional 20% if it was something you could quantify. So in other words, okay, you have to do both. Now, what's the difference, and why am I saying all this? Well, because sin, from a Hebrew standard, sin, right? sin is more of this idea of you miss the mark, and that happens all the time. God has a standard, we miss the mark. It happens in our thought lives. It happens sometimes. I wonder today, this morning probably, I think I probably used my horn more out of anger than instruction. Okay? Now, I don't feel guilty about that, and it's not something that I have to, repay. It's just the reality that I missed the mark there because there was a need for instruction, but my instruction probably crossed into anger. You guys understand that, right? That horn is a great tutor for people. All right? But sin is just simply, I missed the mark, right? For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, right? But this is where this starts to differ. The guilt offering, all right, which is one of the specific, particular sacrifices for the Jewish people, right, is different. It is simply this. Asham is a word that really can be understood to mean reparation. Like you could really substitute that. The guilt offering means reparation. And that is to repay offenses, right, that require restitution. And the implication is that in all of this, the reason why there is an Asham, the reason that this is all built together, the idea is that an offense toward another person is also an offense toward God. The sin is both towards that person and towards that person's creator. So, we must repay the victim and we must repay God. And that reparation made to God is the Asham. The reconciliation to God is the Asham. It is the guilt offering. And that's why I'm telling you today, Jesus is the Asham. He is the sacrifice, the guilt offering for us to be reconciled to God. And it is necessary when we have done something that has hurt someone else for us to go to Jesus and have him restore our relationship with the Father. Now, this is where we get these ideas. We hear it, and I want to maybe see it from an Old Testament perspective for a moment. David in Psalm 51, when he's talking about how he fell into sin with Bathsheba, he says to God, and this is his Asham, really, he says, "Be gracious to me, God, according to your faithfulness, according to the greatness of your compassion. Wipe out my wrongdoings, wash me thoroughly from my guilt, and cleanse me from my sin." You see? "For I know my wrongdoings, and my sin is constantly before me. Against you, you only, I have sinned." And sometimes we get really upset about this phrase. No! Uriah's dead. It's not just a sin. I mean, look at what you've done to Bathsheba. "Against you, you only, I have sinned and done what is evil in your sight, so that you are justified when you speak and blameless when you judge." To understand this, you have to remember that David, for whatever reason, and we'll try to unpack that a little bit today, doesn't even see that he did something wrong when he's going through this process of following his own desires. Until Nathan reveals to him, you've done something wrong. And in that moment, just like we talked about, he has to stop and be like, oh, I now know that I have done this thing. I have guilt. And the first thing he does is say, I have to be reconciled to God. And so we hear that because it is utterly important for us to be reconciled to God when we hurt his people. What we sometimes miss when we stop there is we miss that David then went to Bathsheba. David then kept Bathsheba with him. Not only that, David made Solomon the next king. So I just want you to understand that sometimes we don't see that David did both. He did both. He reconciled himself with God and did what he could to make reparation towards Bathsheba and towards Uriah the best he could with what was left. Now, all of this matters because there's kind of a lack, like I said, of this word like guilt in the New Testament. So when we talk about like how are we going to talk about this, how do we understand this? Well, I want you to see it this way. Jesus is both our sin offering, right, And he is the guilt offering. He is the one who took all of the curse, and so he becomes all of the sacrifices of the law. Does that make sense? Now, that being said, they're not the same thing, though. So the reparation requirement hasn't changed. Jesus fulfills the sacrifice of physical sacrifice that you would have to go to the temple and sacrifice to appease God and to take away your guilt. But I don't see anywhere where it says now Jesus also takes away the requirement for us to make sure that we do what's right and make things right. You see what I mean? Like, we just put everything together. We morph it all into one thing, right? And then we fail to understand the importance of the community to Jesus. See, unity is not just about a group forgiven by their Asham. It's a phenomena which also requires people to be reconciled to one another. So when we look at the terms that we use in the New Testament, we're often righteousness, justification. Those things, from a biblical standpoint, a historical biblical standpoint, would not just require a confession to Jesus Christ, but in the cases in which we've hurt our community, would require restitution. It's included in the term. To be made righteous is also to be expected to do what is right. Okay? So this is a simple idea, man. It's not anything new. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor in place of yourself. So if I ask this question, the reason why is this so important, I just started to ask, what's the practical implications like of unresolved, unmitigated guilt? What are the practical implications of that? So I kind of let Psychology Today and some of these other places help me out a little bit. So when you have unresolved guilt, there's just some things, some realities. I'll just look at them here. Low self-esteem and a lack of confidence. So why is it important? Why am I saying all this? Because I believe that we have some unresolved guilt in this room. And I also believe that we have a lot of things happening in our society due to unresolved guilt. And I do believe that a lot of the things we can't seem to figure out, and when you start to hear the things that happen when you have unresolved guilt, and we have all of these medical things happening and nobody knows why, I'm going to show you why I think is what's really happening. There is a disease, and it's called sin, and there is a weight, and it's called guilt, and those things are starting to destroy us emotionally, physically, in our society. Because when you carry this unresolved guilt, you have a low self-esteem and a lack of confidence. You have a conviction that you just can't recover from betraying your values. You begin to believe that you're a worthless person. That's where shame comes in. You have difficulty making decisions because you're overwhelmed. It gets more interesting. Just wait. You get this intense concern of how others see you and perceive you. Now you feel kind of guilty, and you're a little hypersensitive about how people think about you. You have difficulty setting and maintaining boundaries. You have excessive sensitivity to criticism. Develop things like anxiety and depression. You have physical health symptoms, headaches, stomach aches, unidentified muscle pain, tension. We often call these stress-related symptoms, but guess what? It's guilt. You get insomnia, changes in eating patterns, and what I would say is probably what I find most, social isolation. So I'm looking at Psychology Today, and he wrote some things that I think are just amazing. He says, unresolved guilt is like having a snooze alarm in your head that won't shut off. There's this idea that guilt makes us reluctant to experience joy. So this is amazing. They did a study with college students, and they brought them into two groups, two control groups. One control group, they really made feel good about themselves. The other control group, they worked really hard to make them feel guilty about themselves. Afterwards, they were all given the opportunity to have something in exchange for the participation in the survey, and all of those who were made to feel good about themselves chose music downloads and DVDs and movies and gift cards, and all those who felt bad about themselves chose school supplies. Guilt has what they call the Dobby effect. Do you know who Dobby is? Some of y'all know who Dobby is. Judah, who's Dobby? Who's Dobby? You know. Dobby's an elf from Harry Potter who hits his head against the wall. And the Dobby effect is self-harm, and guilt leads often to self-harm. We punish ourselves to ward off these feelings of guilt. Guilt makes you avoid the people you've wronged. And guilty people who feel guilt, they just always feel like they're doing something wrong, and they always feel like they're overcompensating, saying sorry all the time. This is the one that really hit me. Guilty people literally feel heavier and more labored. Literally. So there are evidence in studies that finds that people who assess their weight, who feel this sense of guilt, like if they always assess themselves as excessively higher in weight than those who aren't carrying guilt. No difference physically, just emotionally, the space that they're living in, and that physical activities require way more effort to get done than they do for non-guilty people. So the reason I feel like this is so important, because there are symptoms of guilt happening in our community, in our church, in our families, in our workplaces, that we're trying to fix with other things when what we really need is to be reconciled to God and to one another. So now let me look at this passage a little bit again. At Pilate, it says in verse 38, that Pilate granted permission, something that typically doesn't happen, and so he's showing some signs of guilt. But really, Pilate's going on this line, and this is how we kind of get away with like living with guilt, is my guilt's not as bad as your guilt. Right? My guilt is better or worse by comparison, essentially, is what it is. And it's him just taking that thing which Jesus said, which is the one who handed me over has a greater sin than you. And so he feels a little bit bad, but he doesn't really feel fully responsible for it, because, quite frankly, somebody else is a bigger sinner than he is. So let me put it in maybe a little bit more of a realistic way. My wife treated me this way, which I didn't like and I felt was unfair. So my going to do other things is her fault, really. I mean, Scripture says her body's not her own anyways, right? This is how we justify doing things that we shouldn't, because in reality, it wasn't my fault. Or, she hurt me much more than I hurt her. She should come to me, if anything. I mean, what do you expect me to do when someone comes at me like that? I mean, I asked Jesus for forgiveness. How about phrases like this? I'm not directly responsible for the suffering of those people. This is guilt mitigated. It's not relieved, and the consequences remain. And quite frankly and unfortunately, it's a hallmark of self-righteous Christianity. Calling all these people to be reconciled to God for all of their sinfulness, and then in our quiet, private spaces, conducting ourselves in ways that are horrible, but not nearly as bad as those sinners whose sins make me really uncomfortable. Oh, thank you. Let's take a look at Judas for a moment. I know we got to go to Matthew for that, but Matthew 27, 3-5. Then when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that he had been condemned, he felt remorse. Okay, here we go. He acknowledges his guilt. And he returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priest. He tries to make amends. Yes, I'm going to make restitution. I don't want this money. And saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. But they said, what is that to us? You shall see to it yourself. You're not absolving yourself through us, buddy. Take your money and keep it. So he threw the pieces of silver into the temple sanctuary and left. And he went away and hanged himself. This is guilt, which turns into shame. You notice how neither of these people went to Jesus? Let's look at Joseph and Nicodemus. John 19:39 and 41. Nicodemus brings this giant gift of myrrh and aloes, equating that of a king. Joseph, in verse 41, and you realize he's given away his entire tomb and his garden in a private place. He's doing they're doing whatever they can to make it right. You see this? They're understanding the one part of it. Their guilt is driving them to try to make things better with the community member that they harmed. You see this? Unfortunately for them, in order to be reconciled to God, they're going to have to wait a couple of days. Because the only way they're going to do it is through the risen Christ. But the reality is they're moving in such a way that we often see the world move. And this is really, and it's what Christians miss the most. See, I hear a lot of things being spoken into the air from conservative Christian circles. Things like, they'll use words like social justice warrior in a derogatory term. They'll use the term woke in a derogatory way. And they do this because what they're missing, and this is what I need us to hear sometimes what we see in society is a reflection of where the church has missed hearing from God. And so we have a whole society that recognizes that it needs to be reconciled to one another because it's divided, and they're working really hard through human standards and means to reconcile an entire community. The unfortunate reality of that is that without reconciliation to God, it will never fully take effect. And so we stand over here self-righteously judging them for trying to fix things the wrong way, instead of engaging in restoration and reconciliation as God would call us to, in the manner that He would tell us. And instead, as Christians, we just take restitution, right, which is a really bad word, and we move it out of the way and say we don't need to do that because all we really need is forgiveness. Right? So now I have hurt you, and I have a way to fix it, but I am still Christian because I said sorry, and you are unchristian because you didn't forgive me. So now forgiveness has trumped restitution, and unless you forgive me, you're a worse Christian than me. And that's the end of it. No, that's exactly how it goes. Oh, you really need to forgive. And the truth is you do. If you hurt me, I need to forgive you without any expectation that you will make restitution because God is enough for me. End of story. However, if you are my brother or my sister in Christ, if you hurt me in a tangible way or even an intangible one where your words pierce my heart, God would ask you to do more than say that you are sorry. He would ask you to restore me to my previous state. I've used this term, this analogy 100 times. But I have a watch here. This watch is worth a certain amount of money. if you steal it from me, and then say you are sorry, and demand that I forgive you, and then keep my watch, does that make sense to you? And yet this is how we deal with one another. I took from you, I hurt you, you forgive me because I said sorry, I'm going to walk away with what I took. And brothers and sisters, that is unresolved guilt. It is guilt that you are not acknowledging, and it is having an impact. I find the disciples interesting because the disciples give us this picture of what happens a lot when we feel guilty. We go find some other people who feel guilty too, and we hang out. Feel a little bit better about myself because we is all guilty. And all of them are doing exactly what they said shame does, right? You see it. What do we see? We see all the things in real time. What do we see with Judas? We see the Dobby effect in Judas, do we not? Yes, we see these things. We see this overcompensation from Joseph and from Nicodemus. We see this avoidance from the disciples. Other than John, they all completely avoid Jesus. They avoid him there. They're not going to the tomb with spices. You see this? Even later, we're going to find out the Marys, they go to the disciples are avoid. They feel bad about it, and they're hanging out together. And I'm telling you right now, it's not a bad thing. Hanging out together, understanding that we have our weaknesses, and finding ways to work that out, and acknowledging our shame and our guilt is not a bad thing. We have, AA is one of the most successful programs ever because it understands the development of community, understanding that you're not alone, that you're not the worst person on earth, but it also requires you to be reconciled to a higher power, which as long as that is Jesus will get you to some sort of freedom, and it requires you to what? Make amends. The reason that people successfully come through AA more than any other program, I believe this in my heart, is because they have to practice reconciliation to God and man. And so then you can walk forward without that added weight of guilt. This is why we have to move beyond, it's just a disease I have no power over. We acknowledge that it's a disease, and then we acknowledge that we have to make amends, and we acknowledge that we need healing from God. But here's the disciples, completely avoiding Jesus, hanging out together, ashamed of what they've done, feeling guilty, but not going anywhere near him. And I find this so interesting because the Marys, to me, are this beautiful example of what we're talking about. The Marys are going to the tomb. You see it in John 20, where we've already talked about it earlier in this series, but on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other gospel tell us, I just say the Marys, because all the Marys were going, all right? All the Marys were there at the foot of the cross. All the Marys are going to the tomb. And they saw the stone already moved from the tomb. Listen, they didn't have to make a confession. They weren't feeling guilty. They were grieving. And with all of that guilt not there, they found their way to Jesus pretty quick. I hope you're starting to hear something, because guilty people avoiding Jesus because they feel guilty is self-perpetuating harm. And I think a great example of this, and I only have one more passage to read, is Peter. We look at Peter, and Peter has betrayed Christ. He avoids him. And he can't get his life back on track. Well, what does this have to do with guilt? Well, Peter does see Jesus, right? But even after that, and even after Jesus says, hey, take the Holy Spirit, Peter says, I'm going fishing. I'm not going to do what God has called me to do. There is this guilt. And it's not until Peter on the shore is reconciled with his brother and his Savior. You know that encounter with Jesus and Peter? Where they have to be face to face. Peter has to make a confession. That confession is that I love you. And then Jesus commissions him. In that same time, he tries to point the finger at John, and Jesus is like, I don't got to be reconciled. That John never left. He was at the foot of the cross. But you, Peter, we've got to be right. You see, this is something that Jesus spoke throughout his entire time on earth, and we just miss it because it's more convenient to demand forgiveness than to require restitution. In Matthew 5:22, this is what Jesus says, but I say to you, and this is where Jesus ups the ante because he always does. He no longer taught, hey man, Old Testament is that you kill your neighbor's ox, you got to give him another, you got to give him an ox plus something else, right? 20%, right? Or you give him the value plus 20, whatever it is. But Jesus, he brings this up a level, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be answerable to the court. Just angry. Angry, guilty. If you are angry, you are guilty before the judge of the universe. If you are angry with your brother. Whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing. I can't begin to explain to you how often I have heard people in church say things about one another, be angry with one another, shall be answerable to the Supreme Court. Whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. Guilty, because you are breaking community. Therefore, Jesus says, if you are presenting your Asham, if you are going to Jesus for forgiveness, if you are asking for him to relieve you of your guilt, and when you go, you remember and you know that your brother has something against you. You know that you have done something to cause harm. You know it. Jesus says, leave your prayer of forgiveness and go be reconciled to your brother. Leave your offering there. The Asham, leave the Asham there and go and reconcile with your brother, and then come and ask to be reconciled to me. Jesus is the Asham. He takes away our guilt. He reconciles us to our Father. But brothers and sisters, our guilt, towards one another must be addressed. To say, God, forgive me, without going and loving the very people he created is hypocritical. And it is not godly. We need to start practicing, brothers and sisters, restitution, restoration, and real care for one another. We must start acknowledging that we're hurting people. We must stop being comparative. We must stop justifying. And we have to start restoring.